Wait! I'm a what? Written by Artina Blackcharm. Chapter 2. Storm Delivery Service. Summary. The Danny Phantom Delivery Service is promised to provide you with a surplus of blankets in all sorts of weather. Danny found himself staring at a map, the first one of Gotham he had seen since arriving, which was a bit concerning since he had already been there for more than a month. It belonged to Martin, who was sitting beside him on the bench. The man had gladly offered to show it to him when Danny asked where he could get one. At the moment Martin was pointing out the different areas. Rich people live in this part, fancy mansions and the like. They got old money, Martin said, pointing at one area, labeled Bristol. But don't worry about that. There's nothing to worry about there. What you do need to worry about is where we are. His finger moved, and Danny's eyes followed. We are right along the edges of Crime Alley, which you already pointed out to Eric. And then to the north is the Brownie. That part has a lot of the trouble you kept breaking up, and folks like Dawson. Danny screwed up his face at the reminder of Dawson. Yeah, I didn't like him. Do others like him show up around here? Martin leaned back against the bench and sighed. Depends on who's in charge. Some like Hood don't stand for messing with the kids, or the likes of me. But in other areas they are not as strict or caring. Then there are the bats. Danny nodded, remembering the bits he's heard about the bats and birds, when he asked Eric about one of the recent ones mentioned on the radio signal. The kid seemed more than glad to essentially give him a rundown of the whole operation. It was honestly impressive how much Eric had known, and when Danny told him so, Eric seemed to preen before running off to the other kids, who proceeded to look at him with a glint in their eyes. The next time he stopped a drunk from getting too close to Tick and Tack's hideout, they had called him back to tell him about how a few cops were bound to come around if the rumors they heard were true. Oddly, they had looked hesitant to tell him the information, but seemed to settle when he thanked them and said he will keep an eye out for any cops. The bats don't come here that often, Danny noted. Martin sighed and waved his hand dismissively. There could have been bigger rogues, and there hasn't been anything big enough to get any attention around here. East End always has trouble, but mainly in Brownie and Crime Alley. And since you came along, we're not in Martin was cut off by something crashing into the bench from behind. The man cursed, and Danny turned around to look at the ground where a kid just a bit taller than Eric was. He realized it was Tack from the metal nails that spilled out of the boy's hands. Tack seemed unharmed, and his eyes went straight to Danny's. Have you ever gone into someone's haunt without permission? Tack asked quickly, as if the words were trying to run off. Yeah, Danny responded hesitantly, still thrown off by Tack crashing into the bench. Ended up fighting with them. At his response, Tack's eyes widened. Did you win? Yep, Danny quipped back, smiling. He still remembered the energetic thrum of his core when he first won a fight with a ghost after crossing their haunt on accident. It had been a good fight, and a lesson in one. He avoided the mistake again, but after the other ghosts learned that he just needed to be told the rules, along with what was polite, the fights and spars became less anxiety-ridden and more fun. I've been in a bit more scuffles since then, but those were more for fun, and they stopped causing trouble in my hunt. Jack was about to ask another question when a yell broke out, and they looked to see Tick, standing not so far away. She was out of breath, and her eyes filled with fury. Oh shit, Jack muttered, before he scrambled to get up and away, Tick quick at his heels. Then he watched the two of them go. He heard Tack's laughter get more distant before he looked back at Martin, who was watching him carefully. You okay, Martin? Martin hummed. Just wondering what made you leave your last haunt. Ah. Danny began to fold up, Martin's map to give it back to him. He tried to speak lightly despite how the reason hurt so much. You know, circumstances happen. Apparently, it was time to go. He thought back to Clockwork's face when he found him. Yeah, he had been annoyed when Stevie first dropped him off, but honestly, he was much better off in Gotham with little kid shadows compared to wandering. At least here he had an inkling of a hunt, whereas back home there wasn't any more. He didn't even think there was anyone anymore. Not after what happened. Not after what they did. No. Hey, kid. Danny's head whipped in the direction of the sound, and he found Martin crouching in front of him, their hands on his shoulders. He looked worried, and Danny noticed the ache in his chest, and how his hand shook. He could see how tense Martin was, even hearing how quickly the man's heart was beating. He smiled apologetically. "Oh, sorry about that, Martin," Danny said, getting up and guiding Martin to sit back down on the bench, even setting the map on the man's lap. "Didn't mean to worry ya, but thanks for showing me the map. And be careful about tonight. I think there's gonna be a rainstorm despite how clear it is right now. Make sure to tell the others." Danny walked away before Martin could stop him. He ignored the calls for him and kept walking. That night, despite the weather reports of a clear evening, it poured and poured. Thunder and lightning filled the sky. There was some light flooding in some areas, including the park. Martin and the others like Panty and Joe were dry, having learned that Danny's warnings were more accurate. But unlike other times, when the mood was relatively light, the conversation seemed as sober as the rain outside. Martin shared what he heard and learned about Danny with the others. Questions about where Bright Eye had come from were muffled by the rain and answered by lightning and thunder. The next week or so was predicted to be filled with storms. There had been a sudden influx of storms, spamming a few states. Reports were saying it may have been due to forces outside of Mother Nature, possibly a villain. Not that it mattered. People still had to deal with the non-stop rain and flooding either way. Even at one particular manor, one butler was making sure that all household storm protocols were being followed, along with keeping young masters from going outside where surely they would get sick or injured. Already, the biggest one was sick despite his grunts, that roughly translated to, "I'm fine." Despite the many attempts of escaping out of the manor, this butler was successful in his endeavor of keeping the young masters dry and warm, unaware of a certain rogue, looking at the storm as an opportunity. The lightning strikes in the sky made Danny feel as though there was electricity dancing underneath his skin, yet he was still walking. Martin had managed to spread the word before the worst of the storm had come, but there were still a few stragglers, that and a few kids that didn't manage to find a safe spot in time. Already he had led 12-year-old Zipper and Jimmy to the small apartment that Sandra and Eric lived in. He delivered some blankets made by Miss Juni to where Gina and some other women were, along with fixing the radio that broke the night before that Martin and Joe were listening to. It had been pretty busy, to say the least, but Danny kept going. The rain and temperature weren't bothersome like it was for others. He walked the same route as he would have done in better weather, while checking some of the nooks and crannies where one could hide, but so far they were empty. He could feel that Lady Gotham was muffled by the weather, probably from trying to do damage control. He let himself center his fangs, and for a moment the rain went silent as it fell. He continued walking and the silence faded away. Then he made his way closer to the edges of the neighborhood. It was when he was nearing the hand that was Crime Alley that he sensed something. Following this sensation, Danny found himself crouching at the mouth of an alley. A cat hiding under a dumpster looking back at him. "Hello, Cookie," he said quietly. "Miss Junie has been very worried about you." At the name, Cookie meowed. And then he presented his hand for them to sniff. He smiled when the wet cat pressed his head against his hand. Slowly, he scooped up Cookie and pulled her to his chest. Cookie trembled but made no move to bite or scratch. Miss Junie had said she was a rather sweet cat. He let her settle and tried to leech off any warmth he still had, not bothering to get up just yet. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't attack me," Danny said. The sound of rain continued, though there was a flash of lightning. In the alley, Danny was at the opening of, there was a pair of eyes that reflected the flash. A growl joined the clasp of thunder and that followed. Then he watched as out of the shadows a 7-foot figure emerged. Their body covered in scales rather than the smooth skin. They looked able to fight, and by the sharp teeth Danny could see, able to bite a man's arms off if given the chance. Though the figure had moved. As intimidating as they were standing over him, they didn't even touch him. Their eyes watched him closely, and then he had the sense that they were waiting for some sort of reaction. Then he didn't exactly have one to give them. Slowly, Danny stood up, continuing despite the tension he saw built up in the stranger's frame. But he kept petting Cookie in his arms, and he kept his own body relaxed. He kept staring at the stranger. The longer he stared, the less tense the stranger seemed. Then he tilted his head slightly. The stranger mirrored him. "I suggest finding somewhere to hole up. The storm isn't bound to end for a while," Danny said, as if he wasn't soaking wet with a wet cat in his arms. "With that said, if you stay in this area, I'd appreciate it if you didn't mess with anyone." The rain continued to fall, and those eyes continued to stare. "You'd get the same treatment too, of course." There was a grunt in response from the stranger. Then he gave a slight nod. "Well then, I will be going. Take care." With Cookie settled securely in his arms, and wet clothes clinging to his skin, then he walked away, fully aware of the eyes still on his back. The storm continued. Then he kept up his routine. Miss Junie had given him a small lunchbox with several sandwiches made for him as thanks for returning Cookie to her. Old man LJ gave him a black raincoat after the third time Danny checked up on him, soaking wet. He didn't believe Danny when he said he was fine. Danny had to admit it was more comfortable, even if the raincoat was a bit big on him. The other folks he checked up on seemed to nod in approval when he checked on them with the new coat. It was the kids that snickered at how it hung off him. "It covers your knees," Jimmy had to squeeze out through his laughter, while Zipper tried to hide the fact that they were laughing too. Then he simply sighed before throwing the blanket. Miss Junie had given him the mission of handing out a Zipper's hat. "Less of a chance of someone stealing my kneecaps, then. It's a preventative measure." Sandra suddenly appeared with a mug of something warm and a smile. She offered it to Danny. "More like old man Alger is a giant compared to you," she said. "Maybe we should call you Twig instead." Eric was crashing into his sister right after Danny grabbed the cup. "No, Brightness is so much cooler than Twig, and he will grow, right?" Then he took a sip, enjoying the taste of lemon in the tea and the warmth it left behind. "Agents, I hope not. What would happen to my kneecaps when they are exposed?" "No one's gonna steal them," Eric said like it was the most obvious thing, and he was right. "You'd fight them off." "True," Danny agreed, and let himself take a few more sips of the tea before heading out again. "I'm rather protective of my body parts. Not fun to have them taken, and it's just plain rude." Jimmy narrowed his eyes at Danny. "When is it polite to take someone's body parts?" "Never, really." Then he shrugged, handing back the cup to Sandra with a nod of thanks. "But sometimes things get weird. If you find yourself in that sort of situation, please come get me." "Sure thing, boss," Zipper said, and then he was too busy with his mental checklist to comment on the new nickname. Instead, Danny let himself look over the occupants of the room, taking note of how Sandra's bruise seemed to be much better than before, and how the kids didn't seem all that worried about the storm outside. He nodded to himself. "All right, I'm going then. Stay inside and stay warm. I know this building has some sort of heating gimmicks. Miss Junie let me know, so I will probably stop by again later with another blanket from her. Agents know where she's getting them." And then he left the apartment. Sybil let out a huff of amusement. "Do you think Red Hood ever worries about someone stealing his kneecaps?" Sandra ruffled their hair. "Hood's the one shooting them." "You don't think Hood would shoot Bright Eye's kneecaps, right?" Jimmy asked. "Nah," Eric said. "There's no beef between them. And Track said Bright Eye's been in scuffles before. He probably knows how to keep his knees unshot." "True, but maybe later we should ask how to make sure no one steals our kneecaps, just to be safe." The kids nodded in agreement, while Sandra smiled in the kitchen and began to make herself a cup of tea. Then he continued his checkup and hid a few more snickers from the kids, even teasing from the working girls. Eventually, he found himself walking the empty streets, checking on their nooks and crannies again, getting near to the edge. It was there that he sensed something inside one of the condemned buildings. No one was usually there because of how often things fell inside, but that didn't prove to be a threat to Danny. He made his way slightly inside, but stopped when he felt their eyes on him again, though this time the stranger decided to remain in the shadows, not that Danny didn't know where they were. "Nice spot. No one comes here considering the safety hazard. Storm's still going on, but the flooding doesn't seem like it will get worse," Then he said, knowing he wouldn't get a response. "Anyways." Then he took out another one of the sandwiches he had stored away in the raincoat. "Miss Junie made some sandwiches when I returned her cat, Cookie, who you met. Thought I'd give you your share, considering Cookie was in the alleyway with you and you didn't kill either of us. Pretty sure she wouldn't give us a sandwich for a dead cat." Then he placed a tinfoiled wrap package on a piece of rubble, supposed to be chicken salad. With that, Danny made his way out of the building, the whole time not bothering to look back at the stranger, who followed until he reached the outside. As Danny walked down the streets, he wondered if the stranger thought his too big raincoat was funny, like the kids did. Later, Danny took a bite of the sandwich and hoped that Miss Junie won't mind giving him another one once he ate the others. After all, it was a pretty good sandwich. The next day, Danny stopped by the condemned building and left another sandwich, repeating the same thing the next day and the day after that, along with dropping the tidbit that the storm was said to be settling down by the next night, though a cold front was coming in. Also that there was talk of cops coming around for some reason. When he stopped by Miss Junie's apartment, he made sure to compliment her chicken salad sandwiches, as she placed yet another blanket in his arms. This one was to go to Old Man LJ himself. When he delivered it, the old man seemed to inspect Danny before accepting the blanket. Then he proceeded to shove a hat in Danny's hands before closing the door on him. Outside, Danny was left looking at the dark blue knitted fisherman's hat. Sandra laughed when she saw it on him, while he still wore the raincoat with the hood up. "Sandra, you laugh at my confusion of old men," Danny said as he accepted another cup of tea she was placing in his hands. Sandra waved him off. "You're not alone in being confused by him." "Oh, so you also have clothes from him?" "Nope," Danny groaned and sipped his tea. He ignored how Sandra looked too pleased, and how the kids in the hallway tried to hide the fact that they were staring and giggling. This was Clockwork's fault, he thought.